Vale a pena. Portanto, deitem a casa abaixo e recebam com enorme aplauso Alexey Sidorenko.
Hello, everyone. Which microphone works? Can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you. It is a pleasure for me to present today in front of you. Thank you very much for your time. My name is Alexey Sidorenko. I'm the director of the project called Teplitsa, the Greenhouse, Technologies for Social Good. And for the last 6 years, we've been helping hundreds of civil society organizations with IT. And today, the topic of my presentation is less technical than any other presentations in the program. Nevertheless, it has a lot to do with information. And not only in Russia, where I originally come from and where I've spent most of my life, and that I studied for 13 years, but it also has a lot to do with any society, both closed one and the democratic society that considers itself open. And also it has to do a lot with you, the engineers, because democracy never depended so much on information technologies ever before. And yeah, Russia is a cautionary tale in many ways. So a week ago, President Putin won elections. In his speech, he said, "We're doomed to success." This is the wording he uses. He got 76% of support, but his influence doesn't go just here. For the 4 consecutive years, Forbes saw him as the most influential politician. In 2017, they just didn't have a rating. They just published the list of most powerful women, where Putin has kind of a difficulty to get inside to. But his influence went beyond that. The recent February 2018 so-called Mueller's indictment showed the evidence of meddling with US elections and the election of Trump, and organizing groups that would create completely fake individuals that would polarize the discussion. They would cater the political messaging to the most underprivileged groups, the most confused groups, and basically derailing any discussion that would be more constructive. Russian troll army also was noticed not so far from here in the UK, in the number of in the elections and the Brexit referendum. And the thesis I make today is control of information is a key to a modern dictator. Tanks, submarines, planes, or drones will not provide you with as much influence as information nowadays. And how did Kremlin and the regime that he leads manage it? I see 4 main reasons and 4 trends that played with each other. One of them is the evolution of the regime itself. The second one is growth of internet role in the Russian and global societies, better understanding of the technology, and external shocks. And I'll start with the last. I will exemplify it with a graph. This is the graph of the internet population in Russia, the internet penetration, and I'll use it as a proxy for an indicator of internet's role in the society. And I'll start with the external shocks, so in order to have it off the table, because Russian politicians say, well, it's not us who is the bad guys, it's the evil West, the Western countries who push their agenda on us, and we have to defend ourselves. And this happens every time there are new restrictive anti-democratic laws, or Russia has to wage a country against Ukraine, Georgia, or Syria. And the external shocks that provided the basis for the more restrictive regulations were the appearance of Stuxnet virus in Iran that really scared Russia's security elites about the physical infrastructure and the vulnerability of internet connected and not connected physical infrastructure. The Arab Spring and just 1 year later, the post-election protests in Russia. Snowden revelations in 2013 was not even a cautionary tale for Russia, but rather an inspiration. They were like, oh, NSA is collecting so much data. I think we should do this too. I think at least this is the dialogue I myself restructure. And the final stroke was the Ukrainian Euromaidan and the former occupation by Russia of the Crimean Peninsula and the start of the war, basically a proxy war on the east of Ukraine. The second trend that created this whole massive arsenal is the better understanding of the technology by the regime. Back in the beginning of 2000s, Russia, saw internet in a very exciting way. Russia spent billions of rubles and dollars in order to connect every school to the internet. And it completed the plan, and this is the largest country in the world in just 5 years. Finally, I guess the most exciting moment was with President at the time, Dmitry Medvedev, and Steve Jobs showing him iPhone 4. And there were a lot of memes about this. But things has changed as soon as Mr. Snowden showed up in Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport. This is his refugee permit. It looks like a Russian foreign passport. And this is, I guess, the real one. The whole world, as you remember, was shocked. There is a lot of data collected globally. Like European countries also were involved in this huge network of collection. They probably are still, at least some of them. And together with the overall growth of internet, this idea, like, wow, this can be used for massive data collection, just what infected the idea of Putin's advisors. So that a year later, in an interview, the whole thing was seen differently. Putin says internet was created as a CIA project and is still developing as such. Those of you who know the story, it was not created by CIA, but ARPA, which is still, and it was not even used by ARPA. They just gave it away to scientists because they didn't see much necessity or much use of it. But still, it shows a lot of how Putin looks at, to my mind, the greatest invention in the modern history. The third factor is growth of internet roles in Russia, and again the factor. Back in 2012, Yandex, the search engine, the Russian search engine, had more users than the first channel of TV, and TV channels was the first victim of Putin's greed of power. These were the TV channels were the first to be controlled and to be taken over by the government back in 2001. So internet just overcome in 2012 Putin's favorite toy. And finally, the fourth trend is the evolution of the regime itself. And in 1917, in the beginning of the 20th century, Lenin, I guess the person known to some of you, known globally, wrote to revolutionaries that the Bolsheviks has to get telephone, telegraph, the railway stations, and the bridges. And these were 4 conditions of successful uprising. This is the picture of famous painter Vasyaloshkin, and he used this meme to play on the current understanding how the Russian regimes looks at it. It's post, Skype, and internet. But you know, the current security services in Russia are actually the descendants of the Bolsheviks, and they know it very well as well. So the first attempts to find out what's going on were already in 1998. The first SORM system that allowed some minor surveillance on the internet, and of course it couldn't deal with the encrypted messages. It's also one more picture by Vasyaloshkin, but referring to the 1970s, I guess, when you had this analogous thing that would record whatever you say in very smiley characters. So back in 1998, it was already installed, and the newer versions appeared in 2002 and 2011. But right after 2012, this is how many new laws limiting the internet appeared. And this leads to the idea that leads to the closure is the Kremlin's cyber arsenal, which consists of blacklisting. This is the way you limit the flow of information. The surveillance, that when you find out what is happening. And three things that can be used both inside the country and outside, in the European Union, in Africa, in the United States. And the defense part is used mainly inside the country. So the blacklist law introduced in 2012 was introduced under the auspices of child protection. Well, who doesn't want to protect children, yeah? Childhood is a very nice thing. And of course it was very innocent in the beginning. It said, well, we're going only to restrict 3 types of content. Everything that deals with drugs, with suicide, and child pornography. But what was instrumental here is that it introduced the registry of banned website. And the problem is that it was only executive ministries who could actually include the websites to the registry, and not the courts. But in the consecutive years, you would have websites banned for many, many more reasons. And also the number of ministries also increased. As long as it's not court, basically any official can see that your website could be blocked, and it could be illegal content, calls for civic unrest, extremist activity, calls for unsanctioned mass gatherings, or being an organization that's considered undesired. And these are undesired organizations. The list consists of 15 of them. A lot of them are major democratic organizations known in the world. So at the end, we have more than 100,000 IP addresses in the banned list, and 8 different ministries who can just, if they see something bad, they can just put it and ban. There is also a story, as we know, that banning by IP addresses can have huge collateral damage. This is the list, and this is the experiment the Roskomnadzor, the legal body that oversees the internet and the blacklist, says that they are implementing. This is, and it lists about 14 million IP addresses just because the ministry decided to block the messenger called Zello. It's a voice messenger, but it uses, the problem is that it uses Amazon storage. And the idea, okay, we cannot, like it uses this Amazon hosting, so let's block all Amazon. Well, they didn't do it so far, but I wonder what happens if they do. Aside from this, there is this like massive new surveillance laws. First of all, it's the necessity and the growing fines if you're not hosting personal data in Russia. The data retention law that was annulled in the European Union. Some of you might remember that for several years it was a European regulation. Well, right now it's a reality with the actual requirement to store all traffic, all internet traffic for 6 months, and metadata for the 3 years. Then the anti-VPN law, and the idea behind this law is that you you require VPN service providers to include the blacklist. So that means that even if you are using VPN, you have to become a censor. If you are a VPN service provider, virtual private network, you have to be a censor as well as the ministry. And then the messenger user registration law that said that, first of all the content inside the messengers needs to be transparent for the government, and also that all the users have to provide their actual phone numbers, and you cannot have a phone number without an ID. And one more thing, and the difference, why it's important for them to store the data inside the country. Well, there are two major social networks in Russia, Vkontakte and Facebook, and the difference between the number of criminal cases of Vkontakte for so-called extremist activity, which might be any radical political view you might have, is 38 times. 38 times more the criminal cases against activists, against young people start in the network where special services have access to. So imagine it's basically the idea that you provide all your thoughts, all your thinking, all your private communication to someone who might use artificial intelligence or machine learning trying to identify you whether you are a good citizen or not. And aside this, the offense. And I think that people in Europe might feel it a little bit. One of them is, I call it the conspiracy to TV, the Russia Today. Only within the last 4 years, and it's very massive, on YouTube, the Russian government, and we have open data to actually know this data, spent almost €1 billion. The second element of it is the Russian botnet, and it somehow might be connected to the growth of far right, because once you have massive botnets on Twitter, in any discussions you can first make toxic any comment section. You can ride with any fake campaign or propaganda campaign that starts as a Russia Today material and then is supported by massive Twitter followership. So this is also where a lot of engineers spent time developing. Finally, there is a troll factory, and a lot of these. This is the building on Savushkina 55. It's the St. Petersburg place where up to 800 journalists actually were under fake personalities, were helping the Kremlin to work on completely different news agenda and also influence the United States elections. So these elements bring to us to the title of this presentation. Is there going to be a closure? Well, and I think of it in two ways. In one way, we can think of the closure, at least for Russians, as this. There is an angry elderly lady just cutting off the wires and say well, internet, in a pig's eye, no way. And I think right now we're not saying that it's going to be disconnected. But at the same time, just recently, it's also the news, Russia is technically ready to be disconnected. And this is the person who is very close to Putin, his main internet advisor. This is what he said, and of course he didn't say that Russia is going to disconnect its citizens, but it's the evil West if it decides to disconnect Russia from the internet. But his words are supported by the Strategy Information Society Development, a document that was passed in Russia in 2017. And that actually says that the government exerts control over whatever we exchange, whatever we create, if it was created on the Russian soil. So imagine, like, network is global. Like, the digital information can be copied immediately and perfectly, and yet the whole government documents actually says that, well, like, we can control this, and if necessary, we can just be disconnected. But in the nearest future, it's still not the case. There is still need for interconnectivity. There is still such thing as local popularity. Recently, the government said to YouTube to delete the investigation about the corruption in the among high-level politicians. YouTube just didn't. They gave the ultimatum of 14 days, and nothing happened. YouTube is still available in Russia. So I think there is still the like big corporations, like Google, like YouTube, can actually oppose these pressure. And also the third factor is that the Russian government so far doesn't have the technical abilities just to be disconnected or to crack the encryption. But then there comes another aspect of closure, and I think that affects all of us. This picture depicts a man who has flows of information in his ears, eyes, mouth, and the caption says, "Stay updated. They won't lie on the internet. There is truth, only truth, 24/7." And I think that, and yesterday I've heard a man telling me that, you know, with all these trolls and bots and fake news, I'm protected because I don't believe in anything. And I guess this is the idea. This is also the closure on the human layer of appreciating information. It's losing the signal for the noise, being unable to cope with the noise, and therefore losing the credible, valuable, and important information. And I think that this is also a question to all of you as engineers, how we can address this information issue, because earlier it was philosophers, journalists, politicians, thinkers, but now with this growing complexity, it has to be engineers as well. Thank you very much. Yeah, there's a question.
Let's forget about spreading information across borders. Several years ago, before the massification of internet, there was control of information by the newspapers and the TV, right? So how is this much different from now?
So is the newspapers and television different from the internet, you mean?
How people in the country is affected in a different way instead of being only by television and newspaper.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, yes, I mean, on one hand, we can say that it's not much different, but I still would say that, first of all, speed, the immediacy, the ability to use artificial intelligence, and I mean artificial intelligence like algorithms, which also means that it requires significantly less resources to affect human brain, because the technologies had evolved much faster than our cognitive abilities. And also, so this would be two things that make it different. And the third thing is the thing about surveillance. The newspaper doesn't know what you're doing when you're, like basically the newspaper has only limited feedback loops to know about its readers. So does the television. Whereas for internet, we have immersive, huge feedback loops, sometimes getting more information that they are supposed to get. And I think that this makes a crucial difference. It will not be, we will not find these big conceptual differences, but we might actually miss these tiny little details that completely change the picture. At least this, I mean, you might disagree with me, but this would be my answer.
So in your opinion, how can we protect ourselves from that?
Well, that's a good question. How can we protect? I think that we need first to realize that we control our data, and this is for us to decide what data that we share. And I think that this could be both done instrumentally, but as well as legally and societally. The whole Cambridge Analytica scandal shows that basically the whole design of Facebook allowed for immersive data collection. And I think that this has to be addressed. People need to be aware, and this is one thing when it comes to to protection. And aside from the when it comes to, for example, political advertisement and the offense tools that I was speaking of, I think it's really important who is paying for politically addressed or socially, who pays for the political advertisement. I think that this situation has to be much more transparent. And I think that in addition to this, I guess more education, media education, most of all, especially for younger people and for those who just connected, but I mean education for seniors, because seniors have significant disadvantages when it comes to technology and to to something that is really new to them, and they have less resources compared to the young people. So I guess this would be my very broad recipes what we can do.
According to what you said, what stops Russia from disconnecting themselves from the internet is the lack of technology and the sheer popularity of some websites like YouTube. But when they get the technology, can't they just disconnect themselves, or could possibly something happen within the country if they did?
Well, so once again, the question is that whether, if this can happen, if they can disconnect at some time in the future.
Yeah, that's basically the question.
Well, I think that it's, so far at least, it's unlikely, but it's possible, and I think that it will not be like a complete disconnection like in 2011 in Egypt. In Egypt, as we know, the internet was completely disconnected. It was one of the few countries that actually did this, and this created a huge information vacuum, which resulted in the change of government. But I think what we can see, and what at least to me is much more probable, that the disconnection would be much subtler. It would be made in a much more subtle way. For example, the first step, that you create all the same services. You have the website that looks like YouTube, that works like, basically you start to copy any service like this. The second thing, you introduce your own standards. For example, you just say that, okay, you need a very special type of encryption, and this encryption would have master encryption keys in the hands of secret services. And they say well, only this standard is allowed on our websites if you want to make business. So all the business just moves to this type of encryption. Then you limit the speed. And then so that any websites outside, or any websites even that are accessed via Tor or VPN network, are just slower, are just not cool anymore. And by this, you first create the behavior of users that prefers local websites, completely controlled, and then after you get it, you have some freedom actually to, this website is so far, it doesn't work anymore. And besides, you don't even need to use it. I think that if the disconnection happens, this might actually work this way, and I'm really afraid that this might happen.
Thank you.
Hello. I wanted to ask you, what are your provisions for the future? As in, do you think in Russia people will have more access to the internet, or it will only get worse over time?
Well, I think that when we are speaking of technical accessibility, I think that there will be more people using at least the internet as a service. I mean, it will be like RUNET, which is, as I said, might be very limited and not entirely connected with the rest of the world. I think that, as a humanity, we're going to the age of complete connectedness, and I think Russia also will follow suit. But the nuances are very important. I mean, the speed, the being able to connect to others, to Portugal, to UK, to any other place. I'm not so sure about this, and I just painted this dark scenario, what actually might go wrong with this. But I don't have dark scenarios about connectivity at all, in general. I think that the current state of technology actually leads us that not only every human will be connected, but every piece, physical thing as well.
Okay, thank you.
So we talked about the internet and its effects on politics, and we do talk about how the US, and you also talked about Germany, it influenced their elections. You talked about education in regard of the internet to solve those problems in the small communities in the US, right? And now that with
with the target groups that were targeted by the
yes, that's what I'm talking
internet
about.
trolls.
I was wondering, do you think that is profitable for Trump to teach the small communities how to teach the small communities to learn about the internet and to not get baited by these troll farms? Don't you think he made a profit? He became president because of it, or at least it helped.
Well, it's hard for me to think of what's inside of Trump's head, but I think that even if it's not the particular president who is obviously got his power through a very populistic agenda, I think that populists in general are not welcoming when it comes to education. I think that the education is the main enemy of any populistic politician. But at the same time, I think that it doesn't mean that all the politicians are populistic. I think that the politicians that build their voter support on the educated votes are definitely interested. So the least privileged groups have education, that they have enough information to make their own decisions and not to be lured into the myths or propaganda. So I think that those people who thrive on propaganda will be not interested in any education, and I believe that Trump, definitely it's not his objective number one, but there are other politicians in the world.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. Could this be the calm before the storm of a Cold War #2, or even the start of Russia becoming like North Korea, where the information doesn't get in or get out?
Mm-hmm. So the Cold War #2, you mean with this whole nuclear things? And the second question, could you repeat it, please?
Where like Russia becomes isolated from the rest of the world.
Okay, so I think that the whole Cold War thing, I don't think it's going to be like the same as the Cold War, like as we know it from the history of the 20th century. Although I should say that this, and also because Russia is not Soviet Union, it doesn't have a global agenda, like global communistic agenda that could lure in some like countries, like large country blocks. Right now we have basically one very skillful dictator dealing with his own frustrations in politics. But so I don't think it will be as a Cold War and the bipolar world as we know it. But as for the country, if we imagine this scenario of complete, like no signal in, no signal out, well, I think that this is something that it's really, it will be the beginning of the end. This is this type of, if this happens, I think that it will explode in the number of national conflicts at the end in like 30 or 40 years. And maybe also international, because right now the world is getting smaller, so it's not only border conflicts, but also like on a much global scale. And also I think that it will end up in the degradation of the society, so that people without the increasing speeds of information flows, like if they will be completely deprived of this, I think that the overall level of knowledge, of education will decline, and yeah, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is the time we have. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you very much.